I'm Beth Sinclair, and the year I turned 26, my own mother told me to stop being her problem. My husband had been gone for 11 days. I stood on her porch with two one-year-olds asleep in the backseat of the car, asking for 3 weeks and a place to stay, and she looked at me the way someone looks at an unexpected bill. I'll tell you exactly what she said. But first, remember her face, because 8 years later, that same expression would freeze on my property in front of 300 people waiting for a check that was never coming. None of them expected it. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother. They all believed the story ended the night the porch light went dark. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family situations and the quiet ones learn the biggest lessons. If you enjoy stories about betrayal, gratitude, and long overdue justice, you're in the right place. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. This story starts in the cold and ends with $100 million and one sentence that cleared an entire room. Let me take you back to that porch. Daniel died on a Tuesday in October, trapped beneath a tractor that rolled over on a slope he'd worked 100 times before. He was 28. I was 26. Our twins, Caleb and Hannah, had just learned how to clap. The hospital called at 4:11 that afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was heating bottles, and the microwave still had 11 seconds left when I answered. They asked me to come in. They didn't explain why over the phone. They never do. I drove 40 minutes with my hands fixed on the steering wheel and my mind completely empty. At the hospital, I signed 3 forms at the counter. My signature stayed steady, and somehow that felt wrong. A nurse asked whether there was someone I could call. I said yes. That was a lie. The truth was that my lease expired in 19 days, I had $400 in checking, and Daniel never finished setting up the life insurance policy he always planned to get. We were young, working hard, and convinced there would always be more time. People our age usually think there will be. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor between 2 cribs and read numbers out loud because numbers were easier than grief. Rent, daycare, truck payments, diapers in 2 sizes. I checked the math twice and got the same answer both times. No. I had exactly 2 doors left to knock on, and I had already chosen the first one. It turned out to be the wrong choice. I learned that by morning. My parents lived 90 minutes east in a brick house that always had a seasonal wreath hanging on the front door. Growing up there, I learned how to be useful. My younger brother Travis got soccer fees and new cleats. I got a part-time job and lectures about responsibility. I convinced myself that made me the strong one. I drove there with the twins because I had nowhere else to go. I knocked. My mother, Linda, opened the door. She did not move aside. I asked for 3 weeks, a couch, a corner, anything. Just enough time to sort out the insurance situation and catch my breath. My father, Gary, stood in the hallway behind her, staring at the floor. Travis cracked open his bedroom door, saw it was me, and shut it again. My mother folded her arms across her cardigan and said the family was stretched thin. She said 2 babies were a lot to take on. She reminded me that I was an adult and adults handled their own problems. Then she said the sentence I carried for 8 years. "We can't be your safety net, Bethany." One of the babies stirred in the car. The porch light buzzed overhead. I said, "Okay," because there wasn't anything else to say. Then I carried 2 car seats back down the steps while my mother watched from behind the screen door. Somewhere between the second step and the truck, the porch light switched off as if even the house was finished with me. I didn't cry until I crossed the county line. Then I called the only other number I had. I called Ruth Sinclair, Daniel's mother. I only meant to tell her I was struggling. That was all. I didn't ask for anything because asking had already cost me something I couldn't quite describe. Ruth listened for maybe 20 seconds. Then she asked, "Where are you right now?" I told her. "A gas station off Route 9. She said, "Don't move." 40 minutes later, Walt Sinclair's truck pulled in beside mine. The headlights washed over 2 sleeping babies. The old man climbed out without saying a word and started moving car seats as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. Ruth came around the passenger side carrying a blue quilt stitched with white stars. It was the same quilt she'd made when the twins were born. She wrapped Caleb in it, then Hannah. right there beneath the fluorescent lights. After that, she placed something warm in my hands. A chipped casserole dish the color of marigolds. Foil covered the top. It was still hot, like she'd pulled it straight from the stove before leaving home. I started to tell her I couldn't accept it. I didn't want to become a burden. Ruth stopped me the way only a truly kind person can. Gently, completely. She looked at Walt and said, "Set 2 more plates, they're ours now." That was it. No conditions, no speeches, no lecture about handling my own problems. Just 7 words spoken in a gas station parking lot. I followed their taillights 40 miles to a struggling horse operation in Cedar Hollow, Texas. At the time, I didn't realize it, but I had just met my real family. The Sinclair property was 80 acres of good intentions and bad luck. The barn needed a new roof. The fencing needed repairs everywhere. There was a mortgage Walt never discussed in front of guests. They put the twins in Daniel's old room. I stayed across the hall. For the first week, I mostly stared at the ceiling and listened to horses moving in the darkness. Here's what nobody at my parents' house ever bothered to learn about me. I had a degree in equine science. It took 6 years of night classes and double shifts at a veterinary clinic. I paid for every bit of it myself. I understood bloodlines. I understood conformation. I knew the difference between a horse that was truly sound and one that simply hadn't failed yet. So on the 9th day, when Walt took me out to look at the stock, I stopped at a stall near the back. Inside stood a 4-year-old bay mare with a left front leg that turned inward slightly at the knee. Walt said she was headed to auction that Saturday. Nobody wanted a mare with a crooked leg. He couldn't afford to keep feeding animals that wouldn't sell. I stood there for a long time. Everyone else saw a flaw. I saw something else. When she moved across the straw, I noticed that turned-in leg let her load and push off a fraction faster than a perfectly straight-legged horse. I asked Walt to give me until spring. He looked at me as though I'd lost my mind. Then he looked at the mare. Then he nodded. Her name was Juniper. She was the first thing I'd chosen in 11 days. I want to be honest about who I was back then, because the picture isn't flattering. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. I simply turned fear into work, because work was the only language I trusted. I took every job I could find. I broke colts for neighbors before sunrise. I drove feed deliveries during the day. I came home to clean stalls and study genetics papers until my eyes blurred. Walt offered to pay me from the ranch operation. I refused for 4 months. Owing the Sinclairs anything felt like a debt I couldn't survive failing to repay. Ruth started leaving plates outside my room because I'd stopped joining meals. One evening, Walt found me asleep standing in the wash rack with the hose still running. He shut off the water and quietly said, "Beth, nobody's keeping score out here." I didn't believe him. I'd spent my entire life believing that love always arrived with a bill attached. That lesson isn't easy to forget. The bank had given the Sinclairs 18 months before foreclosure discussions would begin. I knew that number the way I knew my own heartbeat. So I slept 4 hours a night and started over every morning. I called it determination. I told myself the twins were lucky to have a mother who never quit. Years later, I realized working yourself into exhaustion isn't always discipline. Sometimes it's fear wearing better clothes. Still, fear pointed in the right direction can build something. And I had a crooked-legged mare and a barn full of possibilities. I was about to discover exactly what that could become. It took 14 months to develop Juniper properly. I never tried to fight that leg. I built around it. I trained her to use what she had instead of apologizing for it. By the next spring, she could stop and roll back faster than horses worth 10 times what she would have brought at auction. I entered her in a small reigning futurity 2 counties away. The kind of event with folding chairs and a concession stand selling coffee and hot dogs. I didn't expect much. I only needed proof. Proof for the bank. Proof for myself. Juniper drew an early run. When she performed her pattern, that turned-in leg let her settle into her stops as though she were sinking directly into the ground. We placed 3rd out of 41 competitors. 3rd. I stood there holding a green ribbon worth almost nothing, yet it felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in over a year. But the ribbon wasn't the important part. An older woman sitting in the bleachers had been writing in a leather notebook the entire event. When Juniper made her final stop, she stopped writing and simply watched. Afterward, she found me near the trailer and asked one question: "Where did you get that mare's bloodline?" I told her I had built it from a horse headed for slaughter. She studied me for a moment, the same way Walt had studied Juniper. Then she handed me a card. She said she'd be in touch. The card read, Vivian Hargrove. At the time, I had no idea who she was. Eventually, I would learn, and it would change everything I thought I was allowed to want. The answer to why they were suddenly reaching out arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as something ordinary. Travis accidentally forwarded me an email. He meant to send it to my mother, I think. It was some routine discussion about a cousin's wedding, but his thumb hit the wrong contact. Beneath the new message sat the entire email chain, stretching back 6 years the way email threads do when nobody trims them. At first, I almost deleted it. Then I noticed my own name. So I kept reading. There it was in plain text. A conversation between my mother, my father, and my brother from the spring after Daniel died. My mother had written that taking me in would have been throwing good money after bad. She said I had made my choice by marrying a rancher with no money. She wrote that some people were simply a poor investment. My father replied and agreed. He added that they had to focus on Travis's future. Then I read the line that emptied something inside me and replaced it with something much stronger. My mother wrote, "We keep it civil. We don't burn the bridge completely because you never know. If the ranch ever becomes something, we'll want the door cracked. We'll want the door cracked." They hadn't forgotten me by accident. They had filed me away deliberately, an asset they had written down but weren't ready to abandon in case its value increased. The warm phone calls weren't reconciliation. They were maintenance, a periodic review of an investment. I read the thread 3 times while standing in my kitchen. I expected anger. It never came. What arrived instead was colder and far more useful. Clarity. I printed the emails, not for a lawyer, not for a lawsuit. I printed them so I would never again confuse their behavior with love. I'd like to tell you, I spent that night planning revenge. I didn't. That's not who I am. And complicated revenge usually damages the person carrying it. What I chose was simpler and probably harder. I decided they would not receive a single hour of my anger. I wasn't going to call my mother and read the emails back to her. I wasn't going to argue with Travis. I wasn't going to step into a fight he understood much better than I ever wanted to. Instead, I would do the one thing my family never believed I could do. I would outbuild them. I would create something so strong, so organized, and so completely mine that when they eventually reached for it, there would be nothing for them to grab. That was the entire plan. Build. Structure. Wait. By then, Juniper was 9 years old and a proven producer. She had become the foundation mare of a bloodline buyers across 3 states wanted access to. Her foals were the literal foundation of everything the program had become. That night, I walked to her stall and stood in the dark, just as I had on day 9. Only now the barn had a new roof, the bank had been paid, and 2 children slept safely inside a warm home. I scratched Juniper beneath her jaw and thought about doors, the ones that close, the ones that open, and the ones you build yourself with hinges only you control. I wasn't going to fight my family. I'd already learned that you cannot win an argument with people who keep rewriting their own records. Instead, I was going to create the records. I was going to make them airtight, and I was going to do it quietly, starting the next morning. You might think people who dismissed a grieving widow in an email thread would at least stay away afterward. My family did the opposite. As the program gained recognition, they suddenly became very public supporters. The first time I saw it happen, I was attending a major futurity, a real event with large bleachers and a live stream. My mother and Travis arrived without warning. They found me at the trailer and instantly transformed into the image of a supportive family the moment a camera pointed our way. My mother wrapped me in a hug for a photographer from a regional horse magazine, her hands spread across my back as though she were presenting me. Travis spoke loudly enough for a reporter to hear. He said the family had always believed in me. He said they had sacrificed so I could pursue my dream. I stood there while they performed and understood exactly what they were building, because it mirrored what I was building. I was sitting in attorneys' offices creating documents, quietly, Privately, they were creating a public story, a story about a loving family who stood beside their daughter through difficult years. They were laying the groundwork, making sure that when success arrived, nobody would question why they deserved a share of it. They worked in appearances. They always had. My mother could convince a room of almost anything for the length of a photograph. So I let them have their photographs. I smiled when necessary, and I stored the memory away, because I already knew how this story would end. They would build their image in public, and when the time came, I would answer with the one thing stronger than an image: the truth, spoken aloud, in front of everyone they wanted to impress. There was only one moment that almost changed me. It involved my father. After the photographs, he found me alone near the back of the trailer lot, away from my mother. He stood there turning his hat in his hands, the way he always did when he felt uncomfortable. His eyes were red. He said, "Beth, I think about that night all the time." Then he paused. I waited. He told me he and my mother fought after I left, the worst argument of their marriage. He said he sat in his truck at midnight holding the keys. He said he should have driven to me. For a moment, I was 12 years old again, wanting desperately to believe my father would have come. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Dad, that was 8 years ago. Where are you standing now?" He looked down. The silence stretched, and in that silence, I got my answer. Because if he truly stood with me, he would have said so. Instead, he talked about complications, about my mother, about not wanting to choose sides. He had 8 years and a confession sitting halfway up his throat, and he still couldn't step out from behind her shadow. I didn't hate him. That's the strange part. I simply saw him clearly, a man capable of recognizing the right thing, but unable to do it. If you've ever had a parent who only valued you when you were useful, you already know that voice. Stay with me, because what happened next at the ranch is still difficult for me to believe. The offer arrived when Caleb and Hannah were 9 years old and I was 34. By then, the program wasn't simply a ranch. It was a brand. We had a training facility, a waiting list of clients, and most importantly, we had the bloodline. Juniper's descendants stood in some of the finest barns in the country, every one of them tracing back to a crooked-legged mare that almost went to slaughter. For nearly a year, a major Western lifestyle company had been circling, the kind that owns competitions, apparel brands, and streaming productions. One afternoon, their representatives sat across from Pat and me at my kitchen table. Then they slid a number across the wood: $100 million for the land, the facilities, the brand. And they made one thing very clear: the genetics, the breeding rights, the future of the bloodline, everything. I sat quietly with that number, and because I've promised honesty, I'll tell you the truth. It wasn't $100 million sitting in cash. Most of it reflected the value of the bloodline and the brand I had spent 8 years building. Part of the agreement depended on future performance, but the headline number was real, and it was exactly the kind of number that finds its way from regional magazines into national publications. I asked for 2 weeks. They gave me 3. That night I walked to Juniper's paddock. She was 12 years old now, retired, living comfortably. I leaned on the fence rail and thought, selling meant I would never again need to ask anyone for a place to sleep, or a meal, or a second chance. Selling meant the door finally belonged entirely to me. I already knew I would accept the offer. The only remaining question was this: who would I open that door for? The neighbors who had hauled water during the drought and never once sent an invoice were there. The buyer's representatives were there. Walt and Ruth sat in the places of honor, front and center. Ruth had complained that she didn't need a celebration, but I ignored her. I had not invited my parents. I had not invited my brother. I thought about it the way you think about leaving a gate open, and I decided against it. This day belonged to the people who had shown up. There was no place in that arrangement for those who hadn't. The night before, I sat on an overturned bucket in the barn, the same kind Walt had sat on after the first foal sold, and I went over my remarks one last time. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and I knew I wanted to say it calmly. That was the point. Calm was the one thing nobody had ever managed to take from me. June, the young filly, nudged my sleeve through the fence. Juniper rested in the neighboring paddock. I had planned every word for the next day, every pause, every breath. What I had not planned, what never crossed my mind, was that my family would simply walk through the gate without being invited. The way people do when they've spent their entire lives believing closed doors don't apply to them. The morning arrived clear and golden. By 11 o'clock, the arena lot was full. Trucks, horse trailers, the buyers' black SUVs lined up along the fence. Nearly 300 people moved around the grounds holding coffee and lemonade, talking about horses, weather, and the remarkable thing a widow had built out here. A long food table stretched beneath the tent. I had asked Ruth to make her stew. She prepared it in the same chipped marigold casserole dish, enlarged for a crowd, but still served from the original. Some things aren't replaced simply because you finally can. I wore clean boots and a pressed shirt. I shook hands until I lost count. Vivian found me and squeezed my arm. "You did exactly what I knew you'd do," she said. I told her she was the first person who had ever invested money in me instead of opinions. Walt and Ruth sat in the front row near the stage. Walt wore a tie he clearly disliked. Ruth sat between Caleb and Hannah in their best clothes. Caleb couldn't sit still. Hannah looked proud and serious. The lead representative from the buyer's company checked in with me and confirmed everything was ready. Everything was calm. Everything was exactly as I had planned. I walked toward the small wooden stage, carrying a few pages I didn't really need. Before stepping up, I looked across the crowd one final time. Every face belonged to someone who had helped build this. And then I saw them. My mother, my father, and Travis. Walking through the front gate, dressed for photographs, moving through the crowd as though they belonged there. Uninvited, smiling, perfectly on time. They moved among my guests like honored visitors. My mother wore her best coat and that familiar smile she could maintain for hours. She introduced herself to strangers as Beth's mother. She told people she had always known I would succeed. Travis positioned himself near the reporters, the regional magazine staff, and the live stream camera. I watched him lean toward a reporter and say, just loud enough to be heard, that the family had sacrificed everything to help me get started. That this was really a story about what families can accomplish when they stand together. My father followed several steps behind. His hands stayed in his pockets. His eyes met mine briefly before looking away. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to be seen celebrating, to place themselves inside the frame, to make sure every photo and every video showed them beside me. The supportive family, the proud relatives. My mother caught my eye and waved confidently across the crowd, the wave of someone who believed her place had already been reserved. A few neighbors who knew the real history grew noticeably quiet, the way a herd grows still when something unfamiliar appears at the fence line. Ruth placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder. Vivian raised an eyebrow in my direction, a question. I gave the slightest shake of my head, not yet. Then I climbed the 2 steps to the stage. The crowd settled. My mother smiled out at everyone as though she had helped build every fence and barn herself. I placed my notes on the podium, looked at the people I loved sitting in the front row, and began. I never raised my voice. That was important. I'd promised myself that the night before. The louder something becomes, the easier it is to argue against. So I started softly. The crowd leaned forward to listen. And by the time I reached the part that mattered, nearly 300 people sat in complete silence. I thanked everyone for coming. I told them the short version of the truth. 8 years earlier, I arrived in Cedar Hollow with 2 babies and nothing else. The people who took me in never asked what I could do for them. They simply set 2 more plates at the table. I met Ruth's eyes in the front row. Then I explained that I had 2 gifts to announce before making the sale official. And I wanted to do it publicly, because the right people deserve to be thanked publicly. First, I introduced the foundation, a banner unfurled behind me, the Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship Foundation. My late husband's name stretched across the stage. The foundation was fully funded and designed to help young people enter equine science with special consideration for single parents raising children alone. The crowd responded with that warm murmur people make when something meaningful lands. Then came the second announcement. I asked Walt and Ruth to stand. They rose slowly, clearly confused. Ruth pressed a hand against her chest. Then I shared what nobody outside a lawyer's office knew. The deed to the land had already been transferred. As of that week, the original 80 acres belonged to Walt and Ruth Sinclair, free and clear, forever, along with everything they would need to live comfortably without worry. Because 8 years earlier, they had given a struggling stranger a home. You don't repay something like that. You simply try to honor it. Ruth began crying. Walt steadied her by the elbow. The crowd stood and applauded. The sound rolled across the property like weather moving across open land. But near the front, 3 people remained completely still. My mother, my father, and Travis. My mother's smile remained on her face. But it no longer meant anything. It had frozen there. Travis had gone pale. My father stared at the stage as if watching a train pass without stopping. I waited for the applause to settle. Then I looked directly at the 3 of them, and I said the only thing left to say, quietly, clearly, so everyone could hear. Family isn't who shares your blood. Family is who showed up. My mother found her voice first, and it wasn't the warm version. It was the same voice from the porch, only older, sharper. "How dare you," she shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How dare you embarrass your family in front of all these people?" And there it was, the reversal I had waited 8 years to see. The calm person stood on the stage, the angry one stood in the crowd, the exact opposite of that October night. Travis stepped forward and tried to recover the moment. He claimed it wasn't legal. He talked about family rights. He insisted they had contributed. But his words carried no weight, because there were no documents behind them, only a story they had repeated often enough to believe themselves. The buyer's lead representative quietly motioned to 2 staff members. They approached my family with polite professionalism, the kind that leaves no room for argument. My father said nothing. He simply looked at me. For one brief moment, I saw that unfinished confession from months earlier cross his face, the thing he felt but never acted on. Then he looked down, the way he always did, and allowed himself to be guided toward the gate. My mother continued talking as she left, her voice growing smaller with distance. "After everything I did for you, after everything." Then the gate closed. The words stopped, and the property belonged to my people again. 300 witnesses, and a silence that finally belonged to me. The celebration continued, because celebrations do. Within minutes, the interruption disappeared into food, music, and the simple happiness of people enjoying each other's company. But I slipped away for a moment. I needed to. I walked back toward the house and sat on the porch swing. A few minutes later, Ruth joined me. No words, just presence. The blue star quilt lay folded across the armrest, faded now, soft from years of washing. Ruth pulled it across our laps. Out in the pasture, juniper grazed in the evening light. Beside her stood June. The young filly mirrored her perfectly, even the slightly crooked leg. 2 generations, 1 bloodline, both dismissed once, both proven right. Caleb and Hannah came running across the grass, excited about something only children can be excited about. They climbed onto the swing and under the quilt. And for a moment, the 4 of us sat tangled together beneath the same blanket that had wrapped 2 babies in a gas station parking lot years earlier, back when we had nothing. Although that wasn't really true, because what we needed most had already arrived. You might wonder what happened to my parents afterward. I'll keep that part brief. They no longer deserve the larger part of my story. They hired a lawyer. Of course they did. A letter arrived a few weeks later. It contained phrases like reasonable expectation and family contribution. Pat read it once, set it down, and said it had about as much legal force as a wish. There was nothing to challenge, the trust was irrevocable, the deed was recorded, the foundation was fully established. I hadn't built a scheme, I had built a structure, one they could only stand outside of, exactly as I intended when I printed that email years earlier. The letters eventually stopped. Travis's franchise closed for good, the result of his own choices, not mine. And I'll admit something. A small, tired part of me noticed the symmetry. Months later, my father sent one final message. There was no apology, only a sentence. "Your mother will never forgive this." As if that was news, as if it was a loss. I never replied. Walt and Ruth still live on the 80 acres. The funded account allowed Walt to finally fix his knee. It also allowed Ruth to convince him to take a vacation to the coast, the first real vacation of their marriage. The Scholarship Foundation awarded its first recipient the following fall, and I want you to know who received it, because it's the part of this story I'm proudest of. A 24-year-old widow, a toddler at home, working night shifts, trying to study equine science, surrounded by people telling her it wasn't practical, that her situation made success impossible. I read her application 3 times. Then I called Pat. I told her to make absolutely sure that scholarship went through, because 8 years earlier, a woman carrying 2 babies knocked on the wrong door and was told she was a bad investment. I wanted to make sure I could be the right door for someone else. After the sale, I kept a smaller property, 20 acres down the road from Walt and Ruth, a barn large enough for what matters. These days, I breed only a handful of foals each year from June, slowly, carefully, because I love it, not because a bank is counting. Juniper still grazes beneath the live oaks where the kids can see her from the fence. Caleb wants to become a veterinarian. Hannah says she'll run the foundation one day. And honestly, I think she will. We eat dinner around a table with no empty chairs, no hidden calculations. Most evenings are ordinary: stew, homework, a dog sleeping beneath the table. Nothing remarkable. And that ordinary life is the richest thing I own. It cost $100 million to teach me something that was free all along. I spent the first half of my life believing I had to earn a seat at my own family's table. Then 2 people who weren't related to me simply made room, asked for nothing in return, and taught me the lesson that stayed. Love that keeps score was never really love. It was only an invoice waiting to arrive. That's my story. 1 closed door, 1 open kitchen, and 1 crooked-legged horse nobody wanted except me. If someone showed up for you when your own family wouldn't, tell them today. Don't wait for a $100 million reason. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me about the door that opened for you. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.